In today's lecture, we will begin exploring another way of studying sound systems, phonology. We have two main objectives in this video. First, to explore and exemplify some of the scope of phonological inquiry, and second, to provide a definition of phonology as a subfield of linguistics. Let's begin with a bit of exploration. Pause for a second and think. Is there a sound T in the word city? You probably answered yes. Here is that letter T and you pronounce it as T, right? Now think about the word 10. Is there a sound T in it? Yes, there it is, right at the beginning of it. You might be starting to wonder, why is she asking us those obvious questions? Here's where I would like to ask you again to pause and say those words out loud. And pay attention to whether the T sound actually sounds the same in both words. If you're observant, and I'm sure you are, you notice that the T in city sounds a little different from the T in 10. A little softer, almost like a D sound. In fact, the sound that our minds tells us is the same, in this case the T sound, can be realized quite differently, sometimes a little bit differently, sometimes a lot differently, in actual speech. So, this is one thing we explore in phonology, how sounds are represented in our minds and how their actual articulation may vary in speech. Now let's do a little more exploration. You already know how to describe individual sounds using phonetic terms. Pause again and provide a 3-point articulatory description for each of the sounds K and G. You undoubtedly wrote that K is a voiceless velar plosive and G is a voiced velar plosive. There's only one tiny difference in the articulation of these sounds. Our vocal cords vibrate for G and do not vibrate for K. And that is not even a visible difference. Yet clearly, in our minds, K and G are different sounds. They can even change the meanings of words. Compare the words coat and goat. A slight difference in the vocal cord vibration at the beginning of the word changes the meaning from an outer garment to a farm animal. So some sounds are clearly quite contrastive in our minds. They contribute to the meaning of words they're used in despite not having a meaning of their own in isolation. This is another thing addressed in phonological inquiry, which sounds are meaning distinguishing and which ones are not. It's time for a first introduction of some key terms in phonology. Some sounds are represented in our minds as different from one another, as distinct sounds regardless of how little or how much similarity there is in their articulation. We call such mental representations of sounds phonemes. K and G are distinguished from one another only in one way, vocalization. Otherwise they're identical, but in our minds they are different sounds. Therefore, they are separate phonemes. Other sounds are represented in our minds as the same, even if their actual articulation is very different. We call such sounds allophones of the same phoneme. This is what we have in the case of different pronunciations of the T sound in the words like city and 10. In the word 10, the T is pronounced with a slight exhale. We represent it with an upper script H after the phonetic symbol for T. In the word city, the T sound is pronounced very lightly. It's just a tap against the alveolar ridge, and the vocal cords don't even turn off, so to say, between the two vowels on both sides of the sound. This sound is called a flap or a tap and is represented with a slightly hooked symbol. Despite different articulations in our mind, we see them as just two versions of the same phoneme T, and the articulations are indeed different. T is a voiceless alveolar plosive, aspirated. Da is a voiced alveolar flap. They're allophones of the same phoneme t. So to recap our exploration so far, phonology focuses on investigating how sounds are represented in our minds, and which sounds count as contrastive, that is, phonemes, and which sounds count as non-contrastive, that is, allophones. Keep in mind that when we talk about mental representations, we're talking about speakers of particular languages, not all humans in general. A little more exploration now. Which of the following strings of sounds potentially could be English words? Pleg, fneeb, narp, and erpan. What probably strikes you immediately is that pleg and narp are possible in English. You may not know if they are words or what they mean, but they sound like other words that you know, like blog or narc. On the other hand, there is something decidedly not English about words like fneeb or nrop. Nrop is even really hard to pronounce. From the phonological point of view, we can say that English allows for the combination of sounds like pl at the beginning of words. We have it in other words like play or plot, and erp at the end of words like carp or thorpe or usurp. But English does not allow for words to begin with fn or erp or nra. We simply do not have any words that have those two sounds together at the beginning of words. Easy as it is to say rp in general, like harp, we can't say it at the beginning of the word. But there is nothing weird, so to say, about these sound combinations per se. Other languages may very well have them. This focus on which sound combinations are possible in which languages, and on which particular positions certain sound combinations can occur, is called phonotactics. Phonotactics is another area of study in phonology. And the final exploration for this lecture. Read the words on this slide out loud. Water, letter, Thomas, and tunnel. Which of them have the t sound like in city? And which ones have the sound t as in 10? You probably observed that in the words Thomas and tunnel, the t is slightly aspirated like in 10. And words like water and letter, it is flapped like in city. While it is possible to produce a non-flap t in water, letter, and city, it is not likely in normal speech of an average North American speaker. I can't even do it easily. But producing a flap T at the beginning of words in English is a plain impossibility for most people. Why would that be the case? Well, if we conduct careful observations, we will notice that in the words Thomas and tunnel, the t sound comes not merely at the beginning, but also even before a stressed vowel. In the words water and letter and city, the flap t occurs between two vowels. Variation in which allophone gets realized where is clearly predictable, well, most of the time. The variation patterns are governed by tacit rules we subconsciously acquire as children. The rules that govern predictable variation in particular language are yet another focus of phonology. So, let's put all we've learned so far into a single definition of phonology. Phonology is a subfield of linguistics that studies the sound structure systems of particular languages, focusing on how sounds are represented in the minds of their speakers, how sound patterns in these languages work, and what rules govern their distribution in any particular language. In the next lecture, we will discuss the key terms in phonology, phonemes and allophones, in more detail.